We sometimes forget how much luck is involved in success. Sometimes you can do everything right and still fail. I mean, we live in a world where The Iron Giant can be a box office flop, but Despicable Me gets 1,000 crappy sequels. And no doubt, it's frustrating to see something so genuinely great fall under the radar through no real fault of its own. And to me, Klonoa is one of the most unjustly overlooked IPs in video gaming. Klonoa was born of the mid-90s, when 3D gaming was the hot new thing and everyone was trying their hand at creating new 3D twists on classic genres and franchises. Far and away, the most popular genre of the 16-bit generation was the side-scrolling platformer. Your Marios, your Sonics, your Mans of Mega. And so it only makes sense that for the next generation of gaming, developers would attempt to adapt this most lucrative genre into the third dimension. Super Mario 64, released in 1996, certainly set the bar very high, with Crash Bandicoot debuting on the PlayStation a few months later, soon becoming something of a mascot for the platform. At the time, despite plenty of experimentation in game design, it seemed every developer for every system was also sticking to what they knew on the side just in case those new ideas didn't work out. So in other words, they were tossing out platformers left and right, and it only made sense that Namco would eventually throw their hand into the pile. Surprisingly though, rather than attempt a 3D PlayStation rendition of their iconic Pac-Man character, Namco instead decided to create a new IP, one with the goal of appealing to child and adult alike. The result was Klonoa, Door to Phantomile, released in 1997. Door to Phantomile starred its titular character Klonoa, a Warner Bros.-looking cat-rabbit thing, and his best friend Hupo, a wind spirit, as they traveled the land of Phantomile, a world born of people's dreams, in order to stop the villainous Ghadius from turning everything into a perpetual nightmare. Despite the saccharine cuteness the game's artwork exuded, below the surface was a remarkably well-designed platformer with a lot of visual flourish. Rather than jumping on the bandwagon initiated by Super Mario 64, Namco instead stuck with very traditional 2D mechanics, and used the advent of polygons to make the old-school approach of platforming look more spectacular instead of just throwing it all out the window. Klonoa combined 2D side-scrolling gameplay with 3D level design, a style that would eventually be coined 2.5D, with varied and colorful levels that combined action and puzzle elements. This resulted in intricately designed stages with swooping cinematic camera angles and visual flourish, but without sacrificing actual depth. Elements that first appear to be simple background decoration often end up becoming actual traversable landscape later on within that very level. In addition, its childish appearance proved to belie a simple but well-crafted story, with a surprisingly emotional and bittersweet ending. As far as platformers go, Klonoa was as close to a flawless game as one could get. And hey, Pac-Man even made it into the game after all, as part of the main character's signature baseball cap. The game sold well during its first week in Japan and received rave reviews. It was eventually named runner-up for GameSpy's PlayStation Game of the Year for 1998. And winning second place is still something to be proud of when the first place winner was Metal Gear frickin' Solid. Unfortunately, despite all this, the game sold about as well as mud in the States. The terrible advertising for the game, what little of it there was anyway, probably had something to do with it. During the time of the PlayStation, Sony had firm policies concerning not only the types of games that would see release in the US, but how they would be advertised. Sony took great pride in their perceived notion that their primary audience was more grown up compared to Nintendo's, and pretty much all of their marketing at the time subscribed to this sensibility, centering around more mature imagery, or at least what teenage gamers in the 90s thought was mature. Namco and/or Sony's marketing team, apparently baffled by how to sell such a cartoony, whimsical game to an audience that was apparently only interested in darker and sexier games, decided the best way to appeal to the game's Western audience was to liken its main character to an STD. Yeah, that's really what they did. But Susan, I have Klonoa. Hey baby, I want Klonoa. 'Cause I guess Klonoa kinda sounds like chlamydia or something. It sounds like the kind of pitch that began as a crass joke from an intern and somehow actually made it all the way through the higher-ups. But outside of their head-smackingly poor marketing choices, it's entirely possible that Sony was correct on some level. Perhaps Door to Phantomile was a little too cute for its own good. The most popular games on the PlayStation prior to Klonoa's release were games like Tomb Raider and Resident Evil, both of which were grittier, more complex games that were a far cry from the colorful simplicity of Phantomile and its cat-eyed protagonist. Even family-friendly Crash Bandicoot got by on its crass toilet humor and the signature 90s animal with attitude protagonist. Klonoa, on the surface, had a lot more traditional whimsy, and while this was largely to make the game's twists hit harder when the game's story eventually pulled the rug out from under its audience, it required a fair share of player commitment before the story got to those darker turns, at more or less the game's halfway point. And while the game can easily be finished in a few hours, odds are that what few gamers at the time did give Klonoa a try grew tired of its relentless cuteness after only a few levels, never getting to the real meat of what it had to offer, which, quite frankly, is a crying shame. To make matters worse, while nobody truly realized it at the time, platformers were already on their way out the door as a commercially viable genre. Over the years, the market had been oversaturated by tons of mediocre platformers that attempted to capitalize on the genre's popularity without actually thinking about what made them work in the first place. And this inevitably resulted in a sort of platforming crash, especially once RPGs and survival horror games started experiencing massive booms in popularity. Having launched after both Resident Evil and Final Fantasy VII, Klonoa may very well have been a victim of bad timing, an amazing platformer released too little, too late. The second game in the series to be released, Moonlight Museum, was a Japan-only release on a Japan-only console, so I won't dwell too long on it here. This is about Klonoa's Western releases after all. Released for Bandai's black and white Wonder Swan portable in 1999, Moonlight Museum adapted Phantomile's gameplay into a fully 2D format by downplaying visual flourishes and instead leaning into each level's puzzle-solving elements. In terms of quality, Moonlight Museum, while by no means a bad game, is probably the weakest of the franchise, due to its short length and more mundane story, even by platformer standards, lack of any boss fights, and the blurriness that is inherent of black and white portable games of its ilk. The next we saw of Klonoa was in the first and only proper follow-up to the original game. Klonoa 2, Lunatea's Veil, saw release in the US for the PlayStation 2 in 2001. The game's format remained largely unchanged from that of Phantomile, and naturally received a graphical overhaul to accompany the leap to the next generation of hardware. The characters were now cel-shaded. The levels were more vast and with even more sophisticated camera angles, even if they were a bit fiddly at times. Quite a fantastic sequel for the most part, although the levels, while still well-designed, were a bit less intricate, and a few were even just palette-swapped versions of each other. Any other minor gripes I have with Lunatea's Veil can all be attributed to one thing: Namco's attempts to make their new IP more hip in response to the first game's lackluster sales. The most obvious result of this was the complete redesign for Klonoa himself. In addition to being a bit taller, gone are the wide cat eyes and dog collar of the first game to make room for a sleeker wardrobe, and Klonoa now wears his hat rebelliously backwards now, just like all those totally rad kids in school who would skateboard and talk back at teachers and had a girlfriend who lived in Canada. The story apparently also fell victim to this sort of proverbial corporate focus testing. Klonoa 2's plot is, again, a simple but well-crafted tale that works fine on its own merits, but this time was unfortunately bogged down by a lot of needless chatter and angst. No doubt a result of trying to seem more interesting than it actually was. In addition, while Phantomile's villain, Gadius, was simultaneously menacing and charismatic, with simple but sympathetic motivations, Lunatea's Leorina seems like the type of petulant brat who could be thwarted with a mere slap on the wrist and a stern talking to. All in all, I feel this was a bit of a disappointment compared to the first game's beautifully underplayed story, but I'm willing to look past all of those attempts at upping the game's cool factor, since none of them directly affect the excellent gameplay, with the exception of a few maddening hoverboard levels, because that's what the first Klonoa game needed in order to be more popular, right? Hoverboards. Hoverboards and frustration. Lunatea's Veil thankfully received a much more tasteful marketing push than Phantomile, but as they say, history repeats itself. Despite decent sales in Japan and positive critical reception across the board, Klonoa 2 again failed to grab hold in the Western market, and the franchise has yet to see a direct follow-up, despite repeated interest in developing one being expressed over the years. But despite never seeing another numbered console release, that wasn't quite the end of it for Klonoa. We soon received Klonoa Empire of Dreams for the Game Boy Advance. More of a sequel to Moonlight Museum than the console games, Empire of Dreams again revolved around puzzle solving to advance through the levels, this time with the unfortunate addition of hoverboard sequences, though thankfully optional this time, as well as awful auto-scrolling levels that focus on keeping players on their toes rather than solving platform puzzles. Apparently, even come 2001, game designers had yet to realize that literally nobody enjoys auto-scrolling levels in platformers. Even so, the puzzle levels were just as intricate and well-designed as ever, with bold, simple, and briskly animated sprites that work perfectly against the lively but subdued backgrounds, all of which are perfect for the pre-SPGBA's notoriously dim screen. But if ever anyone needed more proof that poor little Klonoa was cursed with terrible luck, Empire of Dreams launched in the US on September 11th, 2001. A day that would prove to be historical, but not for any of the happy reasons you'd expect from being associated with a Klonoa game. Of course, I doubt that the events of that day had any direct impact on the game's sales, but it just illustrates that this franchise cannot catch a break. Being an obscure IP on a handheld platform, nobody was surprised when the game didn't sell well, but the additional sucker punch of being forever associated with one of the worst terrorist attacks in the country's history was apparently enough to put Klonoa into a coma or something, as he fell completely off the radar in these states for quite some time. During that downtime, Klonoa received 3 new games in Japan, all of which were released in 2002. The first was Klonoa Beach Volleyball, the franchise's obligatory mascot sports game spin-off for the original PlayStation. A clever enough idea, considering the original game's primary gameplay premise revolved around inflating enemies into balls and throwing them. This game did receive a UK release as well, complete with English voice acting, a first for the franchise, as while the previous mainline games featured full voiceover, they were all done in the game's in-universe Phantomile language. The second game released that year was Klonoa Heroes, an alternate universe rendition of the character for the Game Boy Advance that combined the franchise's traditional platforming with an action RPG. It featured a combat system in which Klonoa and his 2 party members could do extra damage to enemies by striking them with attacks of a matching color. The third of these games, Klonoa 2 Dream Champ Tournament for the Game Boy Advance, acts as a direct follow-up to Empire of Dreams, and uses essentially the same game design. The only real change was the format of the boss battles, which now cleverly acted more as races than actual confrontations, what with the game's premise being a tournament after all. Though the game debuted in Japan back in 2002, Dream Champ Tournament didn't make its way west until 2005, well past the GBA's prime years. The Nintendo DS was already out, and the PSP was only weeks away. Nobody cared about a GBA sequel to a series that they had already repeatedly passed over on other livelier platforms. And so, as per usual, the game went almost completely unnoticed. Which, as always, was their loss. Dream Champ Tournament feels like a culmination of the Klonoa games, bringing together half a decade of great platforming and level design as a grand farewell to the series. And indeed, this was the last original Klonoa game we got, as aside from a few cameo appearances here and there, including a playable appearance in the Japan-only PS2 crossover title Namco x Capcom, Klonoa disappeared on both sides of the Pacific. That is, until 2008, when Namco Bandai by this point, attempted to revive the franchise for its 10th anniversary with a Wii remake. No, I will not use the term remake. Of Door to Phantomile, titled simply Klonoa. They were hoping the wider appeal of the Wii platform would finally drum up an audience for the character, but once again, lack of sufficient marketing meant the game failed to deliver. Thankfully no STD comparisons this time, but the ads were so blasé as to be completely forgettable. Although thankfully, fan input prior to the game's release did spare us a rather hideous redesign for Klonoa in the US release. And that would appear to be the end of it, as Namco hasn't released a Klonoa game since. In fact, the only notable Klonoa media since 2008 has been the short-lived Japanese webcomic, which began in 2012 and ended prematurely in 2014, when the website hosting it was shut down, leaving the story unresolved to this day. And in 2016, an animated Klonoa film was stated to be in development, but any news on it completely stopped before being officially cancelled in 2019. Because I guess we just can't have nice things. Klonoa himself continues to enjoy a small but loyal fanbase, as well as the occasional cameo in other Namco Bandai games, such as the Tales series. Sadly though, even Klonoa's own creator, Hideo Yoshizawa, essentially deemed the entire franchise terminal during interviews. The Wii game apparently sold so devastatingly poorly that it has completely dissuaded him from making another, including his original plan to remake Lunatea's Veil as well. Heck, maybe we would have even gotten a Klonoa 3. And, you know, maybe that's for the best. If the remake turned out to be the last we saw of Little Klonoa, I could live with that. It makes the franchise feel like it's come full circle, with its last hurrah being a revisit of where everything started. And now, against all expectations, Klonoa is set to see an anniversary re-release early next month. Door to Phantomile and Lunatea's Veil are being remastered for modern consoles as the Klonoa Phantasy Reverie series, giving the little guy a second lease on life, or at the very least, another chance to endear audiences to what they had missed out on the first time. Second chances come so rarely. But not a second chance for Klonoa, mind you, a second chance for all of you to make up for buying the annoying bloated mess Banjo-Kazooie back in the day, rather than what were two truly great examples of platforming. Don't screw this up, you guys. So, Klonoa may very well be one of the most underappreciated franchises in video gaming, and to be honest, it's not that hard to figure out why. A repeated combination of poor or non-existent marketing and bad timing seemed to plague the series from the word go, and while Klonoa's cutesy exterior does belie his true depth, it was apparently more than enough to turn away most players who craved more mature gaming experiences. While I do hope we'll eventually see another installment beyond just remasters, I'm fine with what's been built so far. Whether you're talking about books, TV, games, or film, you can only make so many sequels before you end up with a cruddy one. That's just statistics. With that in mind, Klonoa's bad luck may be a blessing in disguise. Because of his early retirement, he left us with a decently sized stack of timeless games, with not a single bad one in the bunch. There are worse fates. Hey guys, thanks for checking out the video. Hope you liked it. Like and subscribe, all that jazz and whatnot. For those of you who are already subscribed to me, I know this is a bit of a weird video for me to come back on after like 3 years, since I'm assuming most of you subscribed expecting more Digimon content. And I would just want to tell you that it is on the way. I do have a Digimon video in the works. But the direction I wanted to take this channel is definitely the form of video essays, because it's what I'm passionate about on this platform, and I just want to try my hand at it and see if maybe I have a knack for it. But I do have as I said, I do have a Digimon video essay in the works. It's very big, it's very ambitious, and the original plan was to come back with that video so I could sort of segue from Digimon clips to video essays by having something that's both Digimon and a video essay, but that video is not going to be done anytime soon. So I figured I'd start with something a little less daunting, and I felt like this was as good a video as any to try to put out. But anyway, I hope you guys liked it. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that bell. And yeah, that is pretty much gonna do it. Yeah, I'll have more content in the future, more video game stuff, definitely more Digimon stuff. Those are my two big ones. Probably just random miscellaneous crap that I want to talk about. But yeah, again, hope you guys liked it. Thanks for tuning in. See you around. Have a fantastic day.